So good afternoon to all the participants in this roundtable entitled A Multilinear Digital Discourse in Theory and Practice, an example concerning archaeology and Mesopotamian and biblical religion. I greet both those who are present at the Madrid venue and those who are connected via streaming. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to San Dámaso University. To follow this meeting with Professor Giorgio Buccellati and Professor Marilyn Kelly-Buccellati, who have kindly accepted our proposal to offer a course to professors and doctoral students on Mesopotamian spirituality and the Bible. It is in this context that the roundtable we are going to listen to is being held this afternoon. I would also like to welcome Professors Carolina Aznar, St. Louis University, and Pablo Gervás Gómez-Navarro, Complutense University, who will reply to the presentations, as well as Professor Carbajosa, Universidad San Dámaso. The work on the Semitic and classical languages, as well as research on the ancient cultures of the Middle East, are a fundamental part of the preparation for biblical studies in a faculty of theology. It's therefore of the utmost interest to offer professors and students the possibility of deepening their knowledge of all the disciplines that facilitate access to all the dimensions of revelation. I congratulate the faculty and those who have prepared and organized this course and the roundtable. Faith in the living God of Israel and the God of the Church implies a certain conception, both of God and man, in which the historical aspect is decisive. We know well how many difficulties arose in the past to find out the adequate articulation between the investigation of history by means of all the available sciences and the believer's recognition of the saving presence of God amid his people. Fortunately, both the self-understanding of the human and social sciences and the theological perspective have evolved, and today we undoubtedly find ourselves in a panorama that allows for greater and more fruitful collaboration. The roundtable we are about to hold is a good example of this. My task today is simply to open the door of our university to sciences, both historical and computer sciences, to systematic reflection, and to the understanding of believers. All representatives of these areas ask from so many different perspectives about the same object, the characteristics and meaning of archaeological records and literary texts of the ancient East. May I now introduce our speakers. First place, Professor Giorgio Buccellati, currently is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Los Angeles. He was the founder of the Katzen Institute of Archaeology at the same university. As an archaeologist, he has worked in several sites, especially in Syria and Iraq. He's worldwide known as co-director of the excavations at Tel Mozan, identified as Urkesh, the city of the Hurrians, 4th millennium before Christ. He's also the author of a structural grammar of Babylonian. Recently has published a critique of archaeological reason, structural, digital, and philosophical aspects of the excavated record, which is at the core of this round table, and where he develops a digital method to show the excavated record. Marilyn Kelly-Buccellati, she is archaeologist and co-director of the excavations at Urkesh. Her focus is on stratigraphy and ceramics from sites where she has excavated. Because of the war in Syria, she has moved to excavate in Georgia as a member of an Italian-Georgian team. As respondents, Carolina Aznar, PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Harvard University, professor at St. Louis University, Madrid. She is archaeologist, and currently she is leading an excavation at Tel Regev, close to Haifa in Israel, an Iron Age settlement. Ignacio Carbajosa, PhD in Biblical Studies, Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, professor of Old Testament at San Dámaso University. His fields of interest are ancient versions and textual criticism of the Bible. He is the area editor of the Syriac versions of the multi-volume textual history of the Bible in Braille. Pablo Gervás, PhD in Computing, Imperial College, University of London, Associate Professor at Universidad Complutense, Madrid. His main research interest currently lies in the study of the role that computers can play in helping people interested in literary creativity. Dr. Gervás is one of the world's leading experts on automatic generation of fiction, stories, and poetry. He is the author of the Proper Writer software, which was used in the process of creating Beyond the Fence, the first computer-generated musical stage at London West End in 2016. So may now Professor Bucellati address to us his speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. It's a real pleasure to be here for the institutional reasons in the first place that you have mentioned, and but also because of the special nature of our meeting. We actually asked if we could do this, and we are therefore grateful that you accepted our invitation to make this presentation. It's really kind of a self-serving thing for us, because the goal is essentially to get some feedback from colleagues about a project that we've been working on for a long time, and which is still in the making, in effect. So the comments will really help in constructing it well. And this is the first time that we are doing this with colleagues like yourselves. So we're really grateful that you gave us this venue and this opportunity. I will start with just a couple of comments about the background, and then Merlin will present the workings of the system with regard to the data from the field. And then I will come back again with a few comments about the notion of the website as a means of scholarly communication, something which is really not very much in the cards currently in the field. I will start with this picture, not just to show Marilyn and myself as we looked in 1983, but because in 1983, we were using already rather extensively computers in Syria. We were the first ones to bring computers in archaeology. And here we are showing not just a computer, it's one of the first portable computers, a TND-100, but also a plotter, which in 1983 was quite a accomplishment. The reason for showing this is simply to tell you that we have been serious about working on computers and with computers for a long time, but actually not so much that. The main reason is that what we have discovered, found out for ourselves, is that being involved for so long and therefore being subjected, quote unquote, to all the changes in hardware and software. This was before Microsoft. We had the CP/M, the operating system was. So before Apple, before Microsoft. So being subjected to all of these changes has reinforced our commitment to look for the conceptual dimension of digitality. That's in a sense what we are wanting to propose to you today, and to see how we have come up with answers to the to that issue. And oops, sorry. Yeah. And the picture here is the audience that was looking at us, and it includes some of the most well-known archaeologists back then and still now, Margueron, Salvini, Klengel, because it was on the occasion of an international congress that we presented in the school of the small town next to the excavations at Terca, we presented the results of our work. So it's the maturation of this conceptual approach that these pictures want to evoke. As a result of this commitment to the conceptual dimension of digitality, we have, and I have in particular, come to a constant and ongoing refinement of all the theoretical presuppositions that condition the possibility of using computers in the field. And also, in a way, we have also come to study more and more the very nature of archaeology. Just one word about this. Archaeology, to most of you are not in the field, means buildings, excavations for sure, but then buildings and objects. But in effect, the main thing that we do is, the only thing that we do as archaeologists that no one else does is not finding objects. Anybody can find objects, including looters. What we find is to excavate in such a way as to identify and document the contact of things in the ground. That's the one thing that no one else can do. Buildings have collapsed, things have come mixed up in the matrix of the soil, and we have to identify this. So the only objective thing in an archaeological publication, really, that others cannot do is the nature of this concept, is what I call emplacement. How things are in the ground is what we need to study, and especially to record. At the same time, we want, and it's you can imagine the amount of the quantity of links that are possible, because there are millions. Merlin will show you some of this. So we really talk about big data. We have always talked about big data in archaeology, because it's not only an enormous quantity of material, but also an enormous quantity of links among these things, the way in which they are in the ground, the associations within a given feature on a floor and whatnot. So the computers came as an ideal tool for recording this, but at the same time, we always wanted to not only collect the data, but also to integrate them in a narrative, in a presentation that went beyond the database aspect. And the theory behind it is what I collected in the book that the Rector Prades just mentioned, and in effect what we have implemented concretely in the field. And Merlin will now show you that. We'll switch chairs so that it's easier to do this. I will not change the names, but you know that she's not Giorgio.
No, but I put Marilyn down too. Okay, so I'm delegated here to give you the test case, as it were, and show you how the system works, and it really works wonderfully well. After an introduction that gives some background to my presentation, I will deal in. Let me go to the next one. Okay. Oh, look at that. That is the presenter. I will deal with the UGR, the Urkesh Global Record, which is the overarching website. In section 2. And in this section, I will deal with the narrative that unfolds around the moment of excavation. And then in section 3, with the narrative that is based on typological analysis. So that's the ceramics book. And we will conclude in section 4 with a reflection on how these digital narratives contribute to the implementation of digital discourse. So a quick overview. Probably all of you have seen the Urkesh website, but we are excavating in the northeastern corner of Syria. And the site is a large site. You can see from the arrow. I'm going to talk about, sorry, I'm not telling her that. What's wrong?
Try again.
Well, I want to talk about this one.
But it's not showing.
It's not showing this one?
It's not showing on the screen.
No way. I was pushing this arrow. Maybe I should push this.
We'll try with that.
Okay.
Just stay.
Did it show that one? No, it didn't show any of them.
Projecting your slide, but that's why your pointer is not showing.
So what should we do to advance the slide? As she advances the slide.
I see it. Okay, because I was going so fast, I wasn't remembering to tell her. Okay, okay. Okay, so, yeah, the next one. Okay, now the next one. Yeah, okay. So the site is a large site of a tell and a surrounding city. Yeah, maybe if I just say next. Okay, next.
Yeah.
Did you get it? Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on three major buildings. A temple, the palace of King Urkesh, and the necromantic pit. Next. This is an overview of exactly that area. So with the temple and the temple terrace, there is a large plaza between the temple and the religious quarter and the palace. And you can see the palace right there. Okay, next. This is a monumental stone stairway in the leading up from the plaza to the temple. And the arrow shows you that, does it have an arrow? Yeah, the temple of the lion, because we think that the lion statue in the Met and the Louvre came actually from this temple. The revetment wall around the sacred area, you see here. Okay. And this is a closer view of the monumental staircase. The next slide shows you a plan of the whole site, and you can see that we're talking about these. We're pointing out these three buildings, but actually, we're not showing that. Okay, we're talking about these three buildings, and also the Abbey, the passage to the netherworld, which is so important because of its connection with the Old Testament. The palace and then is there the next slide? Yeah, the palace, and that's a plan of what we've excavated so far of the palace. And the next slide is this famous abbey, this famous necromantic pit that we're so happy to find. And the last slide in this section is to remind you that we have a lot of inscriptions, but the inscriptions are on small pieces of mud. And I have spent a good part of my life sitting there trying to figure out which pieces of mud go with which pieces of mud. But it has been worth every moment of it because the inscriptions are so important. It gave us the name of the city, gave us the name of the royal figures, and it shows us some relationship also among all of those royal figures. So it has been great. Okay. So now we'll look at the Urkesh Global Record, which we call the UGR, and I'll just continue that way. So this is the website and of the Urkesh Global Record, and you see that the top has an arrow, yes, has an oval around it, which shows you the main menu, and then what we're interested in is the record, which is it shows the arrow. So the next slide shows us the overview of the Urkesh Global Record, and we're going to focus on. Is that A16? Yeah, we're going to focus on this unit. So we're only going to focus on one unit to show you the Urkesh Global Record, and that is this A16. The sidebar on the left, that's with the red background, presents a narrative of the overall stratigraphy and typological categories found in the human.
So what before, actually, not before this. Yeah.
Okay. And the details of the stratigraphy, including the description of each feature in the book, is found on the right-hand side. So the next slide will show us an overview of A16, and you can see that it is comprised of 8 squares, 5 by 5 each. So it's relatively small, but look at the next slide and we'll show you the contents just of this one book. So there are almost 60,000 ceramic items, that is vessels and sherds. We also recorded 1,138 objects, items. We took almost 5,000 photographs. We did 771 drawings, and we wrote over 4.5 million records. So it is quite an accomplishment. First, next slide. Thank you. The role of archaeology, of ceramics in archaeology. Ceramics are the most common artifacts found in historical excavations of the ancient Near East. They come in extremely large quantities and are very diverse in all sorts of ways. So we're going to use the ceramics as a test case. And maybe when you're thinking of ceramics, you're thinking of these beautiful whole vessels. Well, as you well know, it doesn't happen that way. We're interested not so much in the fact that they are beautiful, that they serve a utilitarian purpose, but we're interested in the role as a big data. So quantitatively, we're interested in this ceramics. At our site, we have analyzed about 1 million sherds and whole vessels. It's quite a challenge. If you look at these next 2 slides, this is 1,000 years of ceramic types only from our excavations. And if you look at the slide after, it's me standing there. We are about to send all of these vessels to the museum. And and it gives you an idea of how we always have a house full of ceramics. This graph shows you the database. These are just statistics from 10 of our excavation units connected to the palace and the temple. They account for a total of 337,000 items. They're simple broken pieces of pottery for the most part. We didn't have over 300,000 ceramic vessels. They're often only, sometimes they have pieces of rims and bases and beautiful decoration, but most of them are only body shirts so without any, almost without any shape. This takes us to the second aspect of our concern with big data, the qualitative aspect. The data is structured according to clearly articulated nodes so that each individual element is explicitly linked to broader categories and can be placed within progressively higher nodes. These higher nodes include the stratigraphy, emplacement, chronology, typology, all kinds of correlations. And it is a multinodal analysis as suggested by the different images on this slide. So it's made possible by our system, which brings together a great variety of different types of analysis. And I'm going to show you that here. Part of the website includes sections that consist of a narrative in standard prose, which is closely tied to the rest of the website. And also it includes tabulations of various types that provide preset frequency contributions. If we look at A16, the left-hand side under typology, we have a ceramics section. You can see that there. This ceramics section contains the introductory sections, including the methodology we use in analyzing the ceramics and the chronological implications. Below this is a description of the importance of these ceramics for the chronology and function of the unit. We're only talking about this one unit all the time. Another important section contains frequencies of A16 only. And so here in this chart, we can see the frequencies of the type of clay and inclusion, so the wares. As you see here, clay with chaff added is the most frequent by far, about 34,000 sherds in total, just from this one unit. So about 57% of the ceramics. And every one of these ceramics made in this ware are further connected to their context. So you can see the arrow that goes over there to the right-hand column. It shows you the context. Next to the narrative and prose and the frequency, the UGR provides a segmented narrative that is constructed by placing in a given order the multiple observations that are made. These observations serve as minimal constituents of a special syntax that organizes these constituents in a meaningful sequence. And you see that here, the A16 constituents. As an example, here is a list of all the ceramics in one culotte. So one very small bag, plastic bag from one context, one restricted context is culotte 345. And their stratigraphic emplacement. So here is the culotte and the stratigraphic emplacement and the chronology of that feature. So this is all of the links that go with that. If we look at just one sherd in that culotte, we can see the stratigraphy and the the typology of that one sherd. And if you click on the sherd, you get the photograph as usual. It also shows the technical details. I'm going through this quickly, but I think you get an idea of how the linkages go. We have seen how within a single excavation unit, we cover on the one hand, the biography, as it were, of a single sherd, while on the other, we give a discussion of the total assemblage of the ceramics within the unit. In just unit A16, we have a total, as I said before, of almost 60,000 sherds and whole vessels, which in itself qualifies as big data, especially considering the amount of detail that is associated with every single one of these items. But we can go even further. And we see this in the next slide. So the next slide introduces us to the ceramics digital book. It covers the entire ceramic production excavated at the site. And so for a total of about 1 million sherds. Here is the title page of the ceramics book. And here we see the structure of this digital book. The left sidebar gives a general overview of typology and a full description of the categorization system. And this is obviously fundamental. The right sidebar includes a presentation of horizons, shapes, and whole vessels. Today, I'm going to just discuss briefly categorization, horizons, and shapes. To start with categorization, I think I need to go back. Under categorization, the ceramics and categories that describe them are discussed. And for example, let us look at the description of the ware. So the clay plus the inclusions, the firing, etc., details of how the ceramic was made. Each ware is listed separately. Here we look at the one called CH, or chaff tempered ware, which is further subdivided according to chronological periods. And here you see the Mitanni period, so about 1500 BC. And description and photos of the ceramics in this time period, the CH type ceramics in this time period. Next, we will look at horizons. And the horizon is a term that refers to large chronological periods. And this is the opening page of the section. If we click on horizon, we get the various time periods that we have at the site. So this is early dynastic 2, around 2700 BC. We get a narrative describing the major characteristics of the ceramics in this period that we have excavated in our site. In the separate sidebar here, enlarged on the right, we have a list of all the shapes that occur in this time period from our excavations. And we'll now zero in on one of these shapes just to show you an example. Here is the beginning of the page that describes the jars in detail. And here you can see it is also connected to a much larger assemblage here shown on the right. And of course, it goes without saying that if you click, you could get the links and get down to the biography of any single one of these sherds. Just as there is a complete overarching coverage of the chronological periods, so there is an analogous coverage of the very rich typology of the shapes. And so here we get the categorization section of the shapes. Here we get a description with the codes of the decoration, the details of the decoration. And for each of these, we have the statistics where each title is tied to a complete list of single items, for each of which there is, of course, the individual biography. So everything is interlinked, and along with the list of the most representative examples that you can see here. So in conclusion, reflecting back at what I have shown you, the meaning of what we termed digital narrative begins to emerge. The first type of narrative is in the form of standard prose, but one that is tightly connected through hyperlinks to other narratives and to the data. The second type is a segmented narrative, what I have called the biography of a single item, sherds or vessels, or this is just our example, but any bead that we find is also given this same type of treatment. It is made up of fragments which acquire their unity by virtue of the syntactical sequence that is inherent in the system. To illustrate the point, I give here the translation. Well, I'm not going to give you the whole anyway. This is the translation in narrative text of what these three screens in the sequence would say. This brings out the essential features of the system, namely, one, interlacing of details, which derives from the saturation of hyperlinks that are programmed as part of the coherent whole. Two, the capillarity of nodes, which is the basis of how these interlinks are structured. And three, the number of arrays and the integration of these arrays, which means that the various segmented narratives are seen as tightly knit and complementary. It is through this set of narratives that we arrive at a proper digital discourse, seen precisely as indicated in the title of our roundtable today, as a compact, multilinear argumentation, such as is possible in the format of a website. Thank you.
The global record has the characteristic of being born out of the multitude of fragments that are found. In other words, it's what I call a naturally digital nature of the archaeological record. There are millions of bits. You saw 4 million bit records just for this one small unit. And we have a total of about 30 units on the site. And these pieces cohere together. So it's not only that we have a database that accounts for each one of them, but they're integrated in these various narratives that Merlin has shown. In a parallel sort of way, but differently, we have also tried to do this for the bibliographical side of things. This is what I cannot really show you now because we don't have enough time, but in a similar way, we are trying to integrate information from a variety of bibliographical sources in a way that is not only a bibliography, but really a series of interrelated narratives, the narratives that are integrated one with the other. The bibliographical sites that we have at this point are one on archaeology, which is the sort of companion site to the book on the critique. And then another one, which is about to be open on Mesopotamian and biblical, on Mesopotamian religion in comparison with the Bible. And on this, Don Ignacio is also helping us as a member of the editorial board. So we'll open this one soon. What I want to mention now, though, is kind of the philosophy. So we have had already a very relatively detailed description of the archaeological website. And the main goal for us today is really to speak of the philosophy, as it were, behind this intent to produce a website that is more than just a database with information, which is really what one has most of the time. As a antecedent of this, there is one marvelous antecedent that Don Ignacio will show us in a moment, but I also will show another one, which is just slightly later than the one that Don Ignacio will show us. This is a, yeah, it is the one. This is a book wheel. A book wheel was something invented by this certain Agostino Ramelli, you never heard of him otherwise, in 1588. And it's a wheel that turns, he never built it, he just designed it. It has been built now sort of as an experiment in some labs in the States, but the design is pretty clear. It's a wheel that turns with the book open, and if you want to consult a book, you turn it to where that particular book is. So you may have a total, I don't know, 20 perhaps books in a wheel like this one. So this is the, conceptually, it is a link, a hyperlink of the type that we have in the digital world. The one that Don Ignacio will show us is infinitely more complex and in fact closer to the digital thing. But the point is that there is the scholarly discourse is based on multilinearity. That's what this is, multilinear. There are many books that are to be read at the same time, and you can't really. Obviously, this is an extremely awkward way of hyperlinking books. The great advantage of the digitality is that it allows you to have something like this, but on an infinitely larger scale and infinitely easier, in an infinitely easier way. But that's not something we have done. The scholarly community has really not produced websites that have the equivalent of this wooden toy. We have enormous databases that are wonderful and extremely useful, but not that. Now, and another one, another interesting, yeah, the next one. No, sorry, there should be one before that.
There is one.
Oh, no, sorry,
No,
one before.
That's
Yeah,
it.
this one. This is a book in 1996, published in 1996, that deals with footnotes. And it's a history of footnotes. And it's wonderful because footnotes really started only in the 1800s, basically. So before that, there were no footnotes. And if you think about it, footnotes are really the crux of our conceptually multilinear discourse that we have when we write a book or an article. Now, what has happened then is that we have not, as a scholarly community, lived up to the potential of digitality. That's sort of my claim. And the UGR that Merlin showed, or the bibliographical website that we're doing, aim to do that. I'll try to say in a few words what, without examples, because it would take too long. So you can relax for about 10 minutes. Even the best website that I know, and there are so many words I can't possibly claim to have looked at even a small fraction of them. But that's one reason why I would like to have your input at some point, see if you know of any. There are more than a container. Essentially, websites are either have a very aesthetically beautiful and even perhaps well-written text, which, however, does not develop an argument. It's really kind of a PR type of website that presents in a short sort of way the main results of a given research. Otherwise, they're really containers. So in a way, if you think about it, it would be like having a book that consists only of footnotes without a text. That's what websites, scholarly websites, are. Possibly with a, or often, in fact, with a brief introduction, but without the development of a real discourse, or of a narrative or a discourse. So I distinguish between narrative and discourse in this way. A narrative is like the segmented narrative that Merlin showed, the one that grows out of the accumulation of specific informations, or a discourse, which is the interlacing of these narratives. So the discourse is a frame that includes many narratives and databases. So it draws concurrently on these. So if you keep thinking of of our book wheel, you can think of it as an enormous book wheel that draws not only on a book, but also, let's say, on a dictionary, on an encyclopedia, on a telephone book. In other words, of things with just data. And in what happens then, if the website is produced properly, if it is written, so we don't really write website. That's the other, basically. What we do is to put data into a website, but we don't write websites. But if we were to write a website, as we are trying to do, then these layers are all concurrent. They really end up discoursing with each other, using discourse as a verb. So the hyperlinks are not just anecdotal. And what happens to all of us, I'm sure, that you start following a hyperlink, then you go to the next, and you forget why you started out in the first place, going in that direction. Well, that's to some extent because websites are written that way. They're almost written to lure you away from the initial argument. And instead, the point that we are making is that they're so construed that you look at a hyperlink because that detail is embedded in a larger narrative that is meaningful in order to explain the detail and in turn the point of departure from which you got to the detail. So it is really like when you look up a footnote, oh, this is really quite interesting. I really want to know what the guy has said. You have to go to the library if you just have a footnote and look up the journal or a book. Here instead, you can go back through the hyperlink to the actual full context, to the full narrative. Because then an argument really rests on a narrative thread. And these narrative threads are what are, again, missing in the standard websites we have. Just two more points to conclude. Cognitive impact and digital humanism. It is becoming more and more apparent that and Don Ignacio was referring me to a recent article which showed how the industry is aware of this, but hiding it in effect, how it, the way in which the internet, but especially websites in effect, which are the core of the internet, are designed, are meant to lull us, as it were, away from the ability to discourse. And this has a big impact, especially on young people. There is a real decline, neuroscientists are telling us, in cognitive faculties, in particularly the children. So beautiful. One of the first books written with this regard was by Sven Burkert in 1995 with a beautiful title, The Gutenberg Elegies. It tells everything. And then another beautiful title by Nicholas Carr, The Shallows. And the subtitle is What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, from 2010. Another one, 2017, by Marianne Wolf, who is a colleague at UCLA, Proust and the Squid. It's not as transparent, the title, but it deals with the same thing. The way in which the Proust and the Squid would be an ideal, because both apparently squids are able to handle multiple narratives at once. But the point is that we are losing, she says, in fact, we are talking to more and more colleagues who say, well, we don't really read books anymore, which is a rather sad comment. Well, that's even more true for children who really don't read much, and especially even when they read, don't engage in what Marianne Wolf calls deep reading, which simply means critical reading. And what does critical reading mean? It means precisely interlacing one argument, one narrative with another and with another, but in a reasoned way, not just anecdotally, not just because you're curious to see what's next. And digital humanism is the last comment. See, we talk a lot about digital humanities. There are departments of digital humanities. Digital humanities have very little to do, in my view, with humanism. It would be like saying photographic humanities. See, a photograph is obviously of enormous use. We'll see the book you're showing us in a moment is based on photographic, but it has really nothing to do with humanism. It's something that is put in the service of humanism. Digitality should do the same thing, should be put in the service of humanism and not dictate what essentially digital humanities assume that something is humanistic because it says so, it's a text or whatever, it's a work of art, and therefore it's a it belongs to humanities, and we then manipulate it digitally. But that's really not humanism. So my challenge, in a way, or the challenge that I am proposing to the field is that it should be the other way around, that humanism should show to the digital world what really matters. And it used to be, I guess, the philosophy was the Ancilla Teologia. Now, the digitality should be the Ancilla of humanism. In other words, it should be in the service of a humanistic understanding of things. And to finish, with just something that ties up with our course in the morning, see, digitality is the supreme achievement of fragmentation. And what we need, in other words, the fragments, we saw it, the million bits and pieces that come out of are ideal. They are naturally digital, I say, this record from the excavations. But that's not the end. We cannot simply drown in fragments. We must recover the sense of the whole. And that's what humanism really can do, can give us a sense of the whole. And we should be able then to contribute in that way to digitality and to the sciences. So this was our very quick kind of overview and presentation in a somewhat technical and non-technical way of our goal. And my reason for asking for the favor of this round table was precisely to have some comments from you from the point of view of archaeology, of history and religion, and of informatics, of IT. So with this, do you need to use
give our seats maybe to the others?
No, I think she can speak from there because she doesn't have images.
Okay.
I think you just push the button. Yeah.
Hello. So, hello to everyone. Thank you, señor Rector de la Universidad San Dámaso, Javier Prades, for inviting me to give my response to Giorgio and Marilyn Kelly-Buccellati. Thank you to both of you for asking me to be here too. It is a pleasure for me to respond to this very interesting presentation from an archaeological point of view. I'm just going to offer some thoughts on, from an archaeological perspective, on the book. The website is based on a critique of archaeological reason, and later on the website and on the websites that are in other websites that they haven't talked about today, but that are based on the same ideas. So first, as it was briefly mentioned in the beginning, the ideas in this book and the ideas in the websites come from the practical experience of both Giorgio and Marilyn Bucellati in the field. They've been working at Urkesh, a major Hurrian site, for 17 seasons, I believe, from 1984 to 2011. And as they also mentioned, they were pioneers in the use of computers in the field. So out of that work, they've been reflecting over and over on the interaction between pieces of archaeological data and higher philosophical questions. I have to say that the book, A Critique of Archaeological Reason, is very, very interesting to read. I've learned a lot. And also very dense. It is clear that you have several disciplines mixed here, as it is acknowledged, not just archaeology and not just computer science, but also linguistics and philosophy. For archaeologists to be speaking about Kant is quite new, I have to say. But it is very interesting, and you learn a lot from it. So we are in a higher level of archaeological reflection and debate here, meaning there's a lot written from the perspective of archaeological method and theory regarding what archaeologists usually do. But Giorgio Buccellati, in the beginning of the book, already mentions how he's not here to define what archaeology is or what archaeologists do exactly, but the theoretical method, the frame of reference for the field. I mean, the idea is to do what the title says, to think from a deeper perspective, what is that archaeology is based on, the archaeological reason. And to my initial surprise, it is defined as a specific branch of reasoning. Then in the book, it is explained why. And it is true that this is clearly something that suits our day very much, meaning today we're in a digital world, we're in a different era. Probably this approach could not have been conceived by many years ago, with the exception of the people of the French encyclopedia that you mentioned. That that was an interesting anecdote, that the French encyclopedia was based on the idea of being an encyclopedia of the whole of knowledge, all of it. And they offer some kind of table of contents that in effect was a website. Today we would call it a website. So, but for the people of the French encyclopedia, not many were thinking this way before. I like how the book mentions how complex it is to make sense of archaeological pieces of evidence sometimes, because first, they're very fragmented. They are very difficult to put together in the sense, and because they are separated from the culture that produced them, meaning this is a broken bridge, as is mentioned, between today and the past. And this is a specific of archaeology. So we have to identify what we find and to describe it. But then we also need to make sense of it. And how to make sense of it, that's the big challenge of archaeologists. The case is made for the use of grammars in the sense that they provide us with regularities as carriers of meaning that we can observe in archaeology as well. And behind it, there is a structural cohesiveness, meaning things are not there randomly. They come from a system that produced them, a culture that produced them. The challenge is how to get there. So here's where the proposal comes. By making the different pieces of data interact, you get to have a more a bigger overview, let's say. But how to do that? Well, the digital means today are fantastic for that, precisely because of hypertext and hyperlinks. As was explained, through a hyperlink, you can connect things instantly. And it's not just databases, because databases are good and they're very important. And by the way, databases are major things today in archaeology. For the people who are not archaeologists, you may not be aware of this, but in the past, archaeologists kept records as a part of their own private records before the publication. What others got to know about excavations was the final publication or the reports they wrote in the meantime. At this time, nowadays, it is insisted that there is a digital data program. So no record is left just for the private use of the archaeologists. If anything happens in the future that archaeologists cannot publish it, or whatever happens, somebody else can access all of the data. So that's a major use that digital means are good for today. It's a digitalization of all the records of excavation, and that is very important. But what is proposed here goes beyond that, much more beyond. It's not just the use of data for the sake of it. It's a way to make the data converse and to provide, as I said, a narrative and a discourse. We've seen the example of how they are doing this with Urkesh, the site of Urkesh, and you heard the magnitude of the project. I mean, just for area A16 is almost 500,000 entries, so that's quite unbelievable. But the digital means we have today make that possible, meaning if those were separated databases, that would be very difficult to consult. But they've unified in such a way that going from one element to the next through the hyperlinks is possible. And you can go back and keep on using it. This allows one not just to observe the data, but actually to study it and to speak about it in a way that makes sense. So I think this is a fantastic project, and we all can learn a lot from it. Well, first from the book, and then from the websites you have produced, the one on Urkesh and others I have seen you've made on bibliography and the Mesopotamian spirituality, religion and spirituality project. I would say these are very good, particularly for cross-references in general, hyperlinks mentioned, but also for the multidisciplinarity idea. I mean, these are multidisciplinary projects. Different people can have a part in the same conversation. And as a matter of fact, this is particularly important for big research projects, meaning the websites that are being produced out of this idea, they are not just websites to observe what was found. It's not like the antiquarian type of archaeology that existed in the 19th century. These are websites meant to produce research and to get ideas out of them. They are, in a sense, websites to study the material and to come up with new ideas. So they're research projects, and I think they contribute a lot to how the field is going to be moving in the next years. Not just for archaeological raw data, but also for bibliography, as I could see in one of the websites. The way to study the bibliography you're using for any project. You have the bibliography, then you add notes, then you have excerpts, you have reviews of people, etc., etc. So there are many possible ways to use this. I agreed with what they said, that this is not digital humanities as such, but this is digital humanism. It's a new way of thinking about the humanities and about speaking about the data in a way that produces new knowledge and new ideas. The only but I have, and I would like to ask you about it, is what type of resources are needed for this? Because I mean, it's a huge amount of work that is put into every one of these websites. Do you see this as something that could be possibly done in small projects, or this has to be done in major projects with lots of funding behind?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. And we unfortunately don't have time to go over all the other points that you made. One in particular, the interdisciplinary aspect is very important, and I would like to go, but we don't have enough time. But to answer just your question, somehow I've never really thought about that, mostly because I was so concerned about doing it that I wasn't really thinking about what other people might do. However, this is becoming more and more of a concern, and so one reason for having round tables like this one, this is the first time we do it, but I hope we'll have more, is precisely to introduce a little more the system and to propose to others who might want to use it. So just two quick comments. In other words, I don't really have a full answer, but I just have two partial answers. The first is that we are trying to make the programs, because obviously this is not done by hand. I mean, you cannot deal with 500,000 records or whatever by hand. It's produced by programs that operate on data entered according to the categorization that Merlin referred to. The programs were programs that I wrote at the beginning in languages that are no longer in use. So we are redoing these programs and documenting them in ways that could be used by others. For both sides, for essentially in Python at this point. We use Perl, Python, and that will make it more reasonable to offer it to others, anybody who wants to use it. The second comment, or partial answer, is that we have actually had some colleagues who have expressed an interest, as it happens in China. So we are actually now training some Chinese students to use the programs in such a way that they could then employ them in their own excavations. And what we are hoping also to do is that if and when we can go back to Syria to excavate, some of the students might come with us and work with us in the field actually, so that they would combine. So in other words, we have some kind of tutoring for it. Just one case in this case, just Sichan in China, and we are hoping that this would work and that it might serve as a model for others too. Thank you, though, very, very much.
Thank you for
Thanks to you for this trend-setting project, and I think we all can learn a lot from it, and we will. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, Giorgio and Merlin, for the endeavor of explaining and illustrating a method of presenting the results of your archaeological research that could be called, with fairness, original, not in the sense that goes against a world that is increasing the use of digital resources, but rather from the innovative way in which those resources, with all their potential, are directed to obtain a web of relation filled with meaning, foregoing an accumulation of incohesive data which paradoxically produce disinformation. I speak here as a biblical scholar, and I do it following the intervention of an archaeologist, or better, after 3 archaeologists. A good friend of mine, Pedro Cabello, is a biblical scholar that has worked under Carolina, and says that the history of the relation between archaeology and the Bible, I quote, is the story of love and heartbreak, a teenage love that after happy years of marriage ended in divorce. After clarifying the reason behind the split, they reach out to each other and are now giving their relation another chance. Joking aside, I would like to react to the interesting intervention of Giorgio and Merlin with some reflection regarding the relationship between archaeology and the Bible and how Buccellati's method contributes to mend it, almost acting as a marriage counselor. One of the recurrent reasons in the marriage crisis between archaeology and the Bible, and particularly between the studies of Mesopotamian civilization and the Bible, regards, as a matter of fact, how the data discovered by archaeology are presented. How often, from a bit of data, usually out of context, mainly because it is lost, excessive conclusions are drawn. A classic example are the conclusions that had been drawn from the obvious parallel between Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian narration of the flood and the biblical text, or from the common themes in the depiction of creation in Enuma Elish poem and the Bible. On the basis of these common points, certainly, it has been said that the biblical religion is just another expression of the Mesopotamian religion dynamics, meaning that it can be understood basically, if not thoroughly, from its roots in the Mesopotamian culture and religion. The method that Giorgio and Marilyn presented allows for an approach to data that respects its nature of data inserted in a web of relations. We cannot forget that what many times is called objective, obstinate data, speaking in the archaeological context, it's data or evidence in the sense that it's given, surrendered to interpretation. And an interpretation is possible only if we understand data's function, namely its meaning in the fabric of relationship of which is part. For that matter, I think there is an immense value in the concept of structure in Giorgio Buccellati's work, A Critic of Archaeological Reason. I quote, "A structural whole consists of a complex of relationships. It is not just the result of any type of clustering, which may be accidental. It is rather a special type of linkage. It builds on a strong tensional factor that tightly links together the elements within the whole. End of quotation. In this regard, they considered objective data that appears when a broken civilization is unearthed, but also the data that emerge from the research on a biblical text must be inserted in the structure in which is significant, namely in a universe of connections. Bucellati talks about the procedure of bracing. I quote, "A brace being like a bridge that spans a gap and brace together the two regions on either side of the gap." End of the quotation. Evidently, broken and gap are familiar terms for archaeological activity. It is difficult to find pieces that are not broken or stones that are not coupled with a gap. Because of it, it is difficult to interpret the meaning because tradition was interrupted, or because they are isolated from the original place. It is then when the art, I can call it art of the archaeologist, is required with its procedure of bracing data that appeared isolated. Somehow, if I can say it, Buccellati's method is similar to that of a wise archaeologist that tilts himself to the piece that was just unearthed by an intern who has seen the whole unit without understanding its value or function. The wise archaeologist, upon inspection, says with certainty, to the surprise of his colleagues and employers, his or her, obviously, and then proceeds to explain its function among the whole. As a result of years, the accumulation of data in his head or her head, the knowledge in very diverse fields, and above all, the clarity of the relation of all the data in his mind. After all, he or her is a wise man or woman or a genius. He can have that bridge that braces together the unearthed piece and the rest of the data that has appeared on the archaeological site. Buccellati's method displays in its digital presentation all the web of relations that the wise archaeologist has in his mind or her mind because of his or her age, his or her attention to all the factors at play, and his or her great ability to form connections. The presentation of data that this method offers enables a comparison between the remains of Mesopotamian civilization and the world of the Bible based on structures and not on partial elements decontextualized. In this regard, facilitating this kind of presentation of the excavated records will make possible to inaugurate a new and fertile age in which the structures of knowledge and spirituality of the two worlds mentioned, Mesopotamia and the Bible, can be compared and can enlighten each other. Buccellati's work, when on high the heavens, Mesopotamian spirituality versus biblical spirituality, original text in Italian, this is a Spanish translation, and the English translation is forthcoming, I hope, is a first and fruitful contribution in this direction. I strongly recommended its reading because it shows the path to follow in the future. I would like to finish alluding to the value that this method of presenting data, what I have called Buccellati's method, can have for biblical research beside its relationship with archaeology. The problems of communication that I mentioned earlier regarding archaeology and biblical studies occurs as well between the different fields of biblical research, that is, textual criticism, literary criticism in the different kinds, philology, history, institution, religion, and so on. How often hypotheses are presented in one of the fields that, aware of connected data, could easily invalidate as they contradict the data of another field. Up until now, and to avoid publishing a hypothesis that with time would be invalidated, an arduous work that covered many areas of expertise, dependent on reading a lot and following many footnotes, was necessary, which is downright annoying. If we benefit from the potential of the digital revolution, guided with intelligence, as seen in Buccellatti's data presentation, we could inaugurate a prolific age also in the biblical literature research. Moving in this direction, we will imitate the amazing work of innovation that represent the Complutensian polyglot Bible of the 15th century. Here you have, next one, a slide. Here you have, this is the first page of the first volume of the Complutensian Bible, polyglot Bible, the 15th century, and we can properly talk of a web of relationship in each page of this wonderful 6-volume work. We can see on the slide, on the right column, that is the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, and the second column, central one, is the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, and the third one is the Septuagint, that is the Greek text with a Latin interlineal translation. We are talking about somehow 60 years after the invention of printing. 60 years after the invention of printing. And at the bottom of the page, you have the Targum, that is the Aramaic translation or interpretation better of the, in this case, Genesis, and a Latin translation. But the amazing thing, you can see it on the next slide. Next one. Or you come back to the first one you want.
Yeah, first one.
It's
74. So the problem of digital records.
Should I say something maybe when
So, okay. So, I hope online you can see what we are looking right now. then you have the Hebrew text, Bereshit, and then you have superscripts in every Hebrew word. That is A, B, C, superscript. And there is a link between Bereshit, the first, you can read from right to left, of course. You have the link from Bereshit, A, to the A in principio, creavit Deus, that is the Latin text. That is for students that knows very well the Latin, and they're trying to understand, to learn Hebrew and Greek. So you have the links between both words, and then at the same time you have the link between this superscript to the margin. So Giorgio, we are the 15th century, we have not footnotes but marginal notes.
Yeah,
that is for every Hebrew word we have the Ruth, the Hebrew Ruth, in order for the student to go as a hyperlink to go to the sixth volume, to the dictionary, to find there the Ruth, to understand what did Ruth means, did words mean. So to finish, after 500 years, we are facing a new innovative challenge of presenting data in an intelligent way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Nacho. Just one word. Well, yeah, come, Pablo. Just one quick word. Apropos of the objectivity and the presentation of the data, we call it Urkesh Global Record because we present every single observation that has ever been made and recorded. Of course, if somebody makes an observation, just keeps it in his or her head, we don't have it. But every single observation appears there. Even when we know they're wrong, we keep them because that's the only degree of objectivity. And that happens every day to some extent, in answer also to Caroline's question before. Every day we have the final in the field. We have the final publication, in effect, because it's put online at this point. Just internally on the excavation, and it will never be changed. The observation will always remain. So the objectivity to which you refer is as guaranteed as it could be within the archaeological field. Thank you again very, very much. Thank you.
Okay, so first I have to thank Universidad San Dámaso and Giorgio for inviting me. And I also read the book. It's not as maybe as important historically as this one, but and I agree with Carolina. It is dense. It took some deep reading. But I also agree with Carolina. One learns a lot, and it is full of very, very interesting ideas. Now, as Javier explained at the beginning, my background is from the world of artificial intelligence, and I started working on natural language processing and trying to get machines to understand text. And I progressed on from that to start trying to understand narrative as a fundamental means that people use to communicate, basically always telling stories to each other. And I have found a number of parallelisms between all the work I've done there and some of the ideas that George was presenting in the book. As Carolina explained, Giorgio makes a point at the beginning of describing this concept of a grammar as something that allows you to build the relations between pieces and how it relates to archaeology, where you have all this stuff that's found in the ground, and from that you have to infer a lot of knowledge that you can't get to in any other way, because this comes from a broken tradition. And when we try to get machines to work on text, we also get, the problem we have is, even though for us a text is a text and it's a whole, for a machine, a text is a bag of words. It's just a sequence of words. So when we work with text, we have a similar problem. And we also work in a similar way. It's we first identify the lexical items and tag them. And then we try and parse that into a syntax tree. And that gives you the sentences. So there's a very clear relation in these terms. But if you just do that, you're nowhere. And that's where machines have been for a long time. You know you have these words and you know you have these sentences, but don't know what they mean. And it's the process of inference from there on that is fundamental. And I think it is also true in archaeology. And this became apparent from all the presentations before. And so when you want to get to the meaning of a text, you find your lexical items, you find your grammar. The grammar gives you relations between those items, but those relations are just syntactic relations. There's no semantics there. And there's a lot that's missing there. And when I started working with narrative, I discovered that a lot of what is missing is this ability that we have. When you read a novel, and at the end of the novel, you don't just have the sentences in your head. You have all the characters, all the locations, all the objects, everything that happened. I mean, you can forget stuff, but essentially you've built a web of relationships because you know about the relationships between the characters and which characters were at which locations at which times. And in fact, you're building a huge picture in your head. And a lot of what you're building is something that isn't in the text, but has to come out from there in some way. And a lot of it is structure, is narrative structure. And you come up with the plot of the story. And maybe it's not just one plot, there's a number of subplots. And which characters are playing which roles in which subplots. And that's not there either. It's very rare. Sometimes it happens, but it's not very rare that a novel tells you this is the protagonist or this is the villain. These are all things that you infer. So I think that the process that Giorgio describes in the book about constructing this network of things and constructing a whole from the pieces is also happening when people read text. So, and I think I'll come back to this in a minute, but the problem there is similar. When we process one of these narrative texts, we are looking for a structure that is not there. We want to come up with the plot and the web of subplots and which characters play which roles in which plot. And in archaeology, it seems to be similar. I'm not an expert in archaeology at all, but you have something, which is what you find, and you need to get to something which isn't there. And in that sense, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Giorgio's proposal. And I will get to that. From the other point of view, I can't really say much about archaeology, but this concept of the website, obviously, as a researcher in computer science, I've had to work on a large number of websites, both in terms of building them and in terms of getting information from them. And I have to say that it is important to say that these websites that we're seeing are probably some of the biggest websites in the world at this point. There aren't that many websites out there that have this amount of information and that scale. And in that sense, I'm humble. I can't really tell you how you should do that. You probably know much more than I do about how to handle this volume of information. But there are things that can be said from the point of view of information technology. I was very impressed by the level of awareness of the risks of technology change, for instance. This is something that people tend to forget a lot. You write your website with whatever tool is most fashionable at the time, and 5 years on, no one is using it, and that whole thing disappears and all your data are lost. And there is a very clear effort in the book, and the proposal in the book, to avoid this and to take measures to make sure that data will be available later, regardless of how much technology changes. It's obviously a result of you having been there from the beginning, having suffered so many changes of technology. There's also a very rigorous analysis of current practice, both in navigating and writing websites. And I have to agree that most of the stuff out there is written without taking real advantage of the possibilities of the technology, and that people who browse through the websites are generally not doing a deep reading, sort of jumping from one website to another and so on, and very rarely digging into the website and finding everything that the author of the website had to say. And that is indeed a pity. And in contrast to this, Giorgio proposes a use of hypertext that does take into account these possibilities that underlie it, and trying to use the links not just as a fancy exit, a fancy walk you can take while you're reading this, but actually to have semantics to lead you somewhere where you will find additional information on whatever it is you were reading. And there is also this idea of how to lead you back to avoid the wandering. You find this link, you go somewhere else, and how do you ensure that your reader comes back to finish what you had started writing? And in a way, this also links to another idea that I found very interesting in the book, which is this concept that a website has no end. You read a book, you get, at one point you get to the end. If you're visiting a website, there's no such a thing. There's nowhere that says, okay, you've now read the whole website, you can now go to the next, whatever. And that is also something that we found is fundamental in narrative. We like our narratives to have an end, and we usually prefer them to have a happy ending. We can also have sad endings, but it is important when we generate narratives, which is another of the things we do. We write programs that write narratives. If the narrative, it's very easy to get a program to add actions to a story. It's very difficult to close off a story successful, and so that people say, oh yeah, that was a nice story, and I know why you put everything in there. So that is a challenge, and I think it's an open challenge, and I can see how websites suffer from that as well. And so there might be something that needs work on. But the proposal for using hyperlinks in this way, when I read the book, I hadn't had such a privileged visit to the website, but having seen it, it's even more obvious that this use of the links is very valuable in making available this wealth of information. This is something that is happening in our times. There's so much data out there that it's worse than not having any, because you don't know where to look and know which ones to take into account. And this provides a way of bringing them all together very nicely and making them available. And I think it's very valuable in that sense. And the idea that came to my mind when I was reading all this was there's so much technology out there these days that is being produced, and everybody's producing more technology, and there's wonderful things. But what really makes these things work, and the ones that have caught on, are not necessarily those that someone had a bright idea and decided technology for doing something, and then that worked. There's this concept of appropriation of technology. People find these SMS thing that someone added as a that kind of afterthought, maybe we can do this, and suddenly this becomes something that everybody does, and it takes over because they're appropriating this technology. And I think Giorgio's proposal is a kind of very, very valuable appropriation of hypertext in aid of presenting very, very complex information. And so I think that that's very, very valuable. And in a way, what we were doing when we're trying to process text is build this kind of network. And the biggest challenge we faced was we couldn't find a representation of the meaning of the narrative that was rich enough in the sense of being able to capture all these things, all these concepts that we know we get into our heads when we've read a novel. And because we've tried logic, and we've tried databases, and we've tried knowledge bases, and we've tried semantic web ontologies, and all of those allowed you, each of those allows you to represent part of what people get from a novel, but it's not enough. And I think this kind of hyperlinked representation has a lot of potential for capturing that kind of complexity. So I'm definitely going to be looking into this from a completely different point of view. And just to finish, all this just made me think that, in a way, when you were talking about archaeology, Nacho was talking about literary criticism or textual analysis, and it was all presented as a kind of confrontation and like completely different views on similar periods of time. But this other way of looking at that came into my mind when I was reading your book made me think that archaeology, in a way, is a kind of a very, very specialized type of reading. It's reading a site, reading something that is there, and it's very different from reading a book, in the sense that it's open to very, very few. You need to be a specialist. It takes a huge amount of labor. It takes a very long time. But precisely because of that, I think it's fundamental, because we can't do without the knowledge that comes from it. So thank you very much for all your work.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Inspiring to have the link with the construction of the text, and one of those, the difficulty of having an end for an automatic end of a text. That's an interesting insight. You know, I often, when people ask me in simple words, what is it that I have in mind for this, I say, well, I answer with a question. Have you ever read a website from cover to cover? And they invariably say, well, it has no cover. So, well, of course, there's no cover, but it's a conceptual cover that ought to be there. A site ought to have its own conclusion, which is what I also try to write for this website. So it's very interesting to see that there is a similar problem in the construction of a narrative, and I really look forward to remaining in contact for
Yes, please.
as we progress in working along both lines. Thank you very, very much for being with us today, and thank you both. Yeah, wonderful. I think. No, I think that.
No, it should be the host.
You mean that with, there should be a cover? Okay, so this is the back cover of the meeting. Actually, the conclusion ought to have been, you didn't show the book in the end. You showed the pictures,
you
so
should show
people
people the book.
should come up and look at the real book.
Yes.
Come and look at the book, it's fantastic.
It is closed. So